Thank you.
All right. So this is our devotional for today. This is called Opportunity in the Impossible. And this is the quote from the person who this story is about. She says, "May it not be that the human impossibility is just the very thing that sets his hands free." This was said by Lilias Trotter. She was a missionary to Algeria, 1853 to 1928. How many of you guys have heard of Lilias Trotter? Yeah. How many of you guys were surprised to hear that that was when she lived, 1853 to 1928? This is the passage for this story. It says, "If you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." This is Matthew 17, verse 20. "They are sorcerers," the locals murmured as Lilias Trotter and Blanche Hayworth trudged into a village in the high mountains above a desert city in Biskra, Algeria. In mid-February 1902, two single British women in their late 40s led a couple of mules laden with Bibles and tracts for distribution. For centuries, the gospel had rarely, if ever, reached this far into the northern edge of the Sahara. Bedraggled from torrential downpours along the dirt trail and unfortunate slip into a waterhole, the women may have initially suspected that their appearance caused the locals to shy away from them. However, Trotter and Haworth soon learned the truth. You see, the French colonial government had said word ahead of them, and it said, no one wanted to be fined or jailed for associating with the sorceresses or accepting any of their literature. Trotter spotted two familiar French faces in the crowd of locals. "Bonjour," she grinned at the spies for the colonial government that had followed the women each step of their journey. At times, the French officials hindered their ability to buy supplies, but the women persevered. Though the work in Algeria often seemed impossible, Trotter had learned to attempt the impossible in the Lord's strength. Saved at a young age, Trotter grew up in a wealthy Christian home with many spiritual influences. As a teenager, she attended an influential conference on sanctification and spiritual life. Then, when the American evangelist D.L. Moody traveled to Britain on an evangelistic campaign, 22-year-old Trotter attended his training sessions and then served as a counselor, leading people to Christ after the evangelist's sermons. With the launch of the Young Women's Christian Association, Trotter's service to Christ expanded. Those in Trotter's aristocratic class were expected to do social service. But this focused young woman took her ministries to a level that astonished her peers. In May of 1887, Trotter heard a missionary to North Africa tell of the spiritual plight of the Arab world. He spoke on a Thursday night, and he mentioned that just the previous Sunday he had preached in Algeria. Trotter knew that the needs of London were great, but if she could travel to Algeria in just half a week, why not serve there? The spiritual needs in North Africa far outweighed those in England, where there are many Christians who could take her place. Trotter applied to the North African mission. Despite her passion for the Lord's work, the mission declined her application due to the concerns of her medical evaluation. Undaunted, she struck an agreement with the mission to work alongside, but not under them. As she was a well-off aristocrat, Trotter could support herself whether she was in England or whether she was in Algeria. She would bear the responsibility for the health risks that she would encounter abroad. Trotter would serve in Algeria for the next 40 years. She and a growing band of co-workers would establish a ministry headquarters to reach Muslim women in the Arab section of the city of Algiers. When possible, she would head south towards the Sahara, hauling as many Bibles and books as her camels or her mules could carry. The wordless book was often her tool for sharing the gospel. Cultural, religious, and governmental opposition often slowed the pioneer work to a crawl. In 1895, Trotter wrote, "There are times when human hope and the courage flag, and the only faith of the Son of God can overleap the difficulties and discouragement, and the land down with both feet of the promises of God." Pondering similar difficulties a few years later, she wrote in her diary, "The things that are impossible with men are possible with God. May it not be that the human impossibility is just the very thing that sets his hands free?" In 1901, she wrote an entry, and she used the same theme. "I am seeing more and more that we begin to learn what it is to walk by faith. When we learn to spread out all there is against us, all our physical weakness, loss of mental power, spiritual inability, all that is against us inwardly and outwardly, as sails to the wind, and expect them to be vehicles for the power of Christ to rest upon us." In 1905, she would similarly write, "It is only beyond what is humanly reasonable and possible that we see the glory of God." Let that sit with you guys. It is only beyond what is humanly reasonable and possible that we begin to see the glory of God. Though the work among the Muslims was hard and the results were few, Trotter firmly believed that the impossibility itself was the arena for God to work. Compounding the difficulties of ministry in Algeria, Trotter's health often slowed her ministry. Following a medical crisis in 1895, she learned that because of her weakened heart, she must pace herself year-round. Most importantly, in an era without air conditioning, she must escape the equatorial heat of summer, resting in Switzerland or England. Her intense nature often balked at the necessity for these convalescent retreats. Never one to waste time, Trotter would use these periods of forced seclusion to commune with the Lord, to write and to paint. In August 1899, she sought an evergreen forest where she could spend 1 week alone with God. Exactly 1 year later, she ventured out into the heathered moors of England. From there she wrote, "Oh, so endlessly beautiful the days are, and they go so quickly. God has many things to say, and one can sit by the hour on the heather with one's Bible and listen." The delays that obstructed her work became a source of spiritual strength for her life and ministry. She gained experience in the work and depth in her spiritual walk. God increasingly opened opportunities for writing, especially during the periods of waiting. She dedicated her first words, called "The Parables of the Cross," to missionary Amy Carmichael, with whom she corresponded with in India. In addition, Trotter got to know Dr. Samuel Zwimmer, a younger missionary who was in Cairo, who published many of her works through the Nile Mission Press. Her handwritten illustrated pamphlets appealed to her Arab audience, and it spread all over North Africa. One quote that she has in her English devotional it's entitled Focused. It has endured well beyond her lifetime. She says, "Turn full your soul's vision to Jesus and look at him, and a strange dimness will come over all that is apart from him." These words inspired a poet. The poet was Helen Haworth Lamel, to compose a hymn. The name of that hymn, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. What Trotter had learned of dependence on Jesus from years of faithful service became an encouragement to generations of Christians that would sing the biblical truths that she shared. When you face what seems impossible, turn your eyes upon Jesus. View human impossibility as an opportunity for God to work. Depend on Jesus, remembering his promise in Matthew 17, verse 20. Nothing will be impossible to those who trust in him. When your resources are obviously inadequate and your strength is undeniably spent, God's power shines with brightness, heightened by the dim shadows of human possibility.
Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. We turn our eyes, turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. And all the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. In the light of his glory and grace.
Does that change your opinion of that song?
Yes.
Hearing the story behind it. This devotional comes with 3 questions. Maybe you guys can ponder this with the people who you came with today. But I'll read them to you. Is something God wants me or you, if something God wants me to, that seems possible, oh, there's a typo, I apologize. Do I see this as a reason to give up or as an opportunity for God to show himself strong? When God asks us to do something that is outside of our means, how do we view that? The next question, how can I turn a physical limitation in my life into something with value? When I turn my eyes upon Jesus, is that only when I come to the end of myself? Or is it at the very onset of every day? So these are 3 questions for you guys to consider at some time. I do pray that the Lord will bless you and keep you.